Do you call coercion and threats by a nation with a far more powerful army fair and square?
Welcome to WatchMojo, and today we'll be discussing individuals noted for their contributions to history who either espoused horrible beliefs or committed horrible actions.
You don't know. You don't want to.
No, of course I want to.
Child abandonment. Steve Jobs. There's no denying the impact Steve Jobs has had upon the technological industry. His personal life, however, was an entirely different matter.
I'm just thinking of a couple of things where your mom was on the phone. You were just a little girl, and she was begging your dad for money, like sobbing and begging. And you, as a little girl, walk up and take the phone from her and say, just give her some money, okay? And like hang up the phone.
Jobs engaged in an on-again, off-again relationship with a woman named Chris Ann Brennan. This romance eventually led to a contentious pregnancy and paternity battle, one that Jobs fought for years against this former lover.
You knew going into this, the paternity test could prove that you were the father.
There are 24 million people in California. That test has a 5% margin of error. That's 1.2 million people that could be the father of that child. And it's not me.
Jobs maligned the personal integrity of Brennan with regard to the fatherhood of the child and refused to financially support the pair, even when it was revealed that Brennan was on welfare. The Apple co-founder did eventually offer financial assistance to his daughter Lisa, but she didn't see a significant amount until after a 1982 Time magazine interview with Brennan that revealed the details of their affair.
As reported by Time magazine, I've slept with 28% of the men in America.
No.
All of them exactly 9 months before Lisa was born.
Abuse allegations. Alfred Hitchcock.
When you have an obsession over someone, it is a terrible thing to be the object of that obsession.
It was often a dream of old-school Hollywood actors to work under Alfred Hitchcock. This was despite the director's very specific ideas about what he wanted on screen and how far he would go to achieve these goals.
Walt Disney had the right idea. If he didn't like the actors, he tore them up.
Tippi Hedren was just one of the prototypically icy and distant Hitchcock blondes that was seen frequently as a trademark of the director's films. Yet Hedren also claimed that Hitchcock deliberately sabotaged her career after she refused his sexual advances.
He said, "I'll ruin your career."
Wow.
I said, "Do what you have to do," and out the door I went.
And did he ruin your career?
Yes, he did.
Hedren also claimed that Hitchcock utilized real birds during an attack sequence in 1963's The Birds, instead of fake mechanical substitutes. This was despite the director knowing full well about Hedren's real-life fear of the creatures. Adultery and mistreatment. Martin Luther King Jr.
Among the claims detailed, Martin Luther King Jr. was involved in extramarital affairs and other sexual activities that, if true and revealed publicly, would have been devastating to Dr. King and his movement.
The civil rights work of Martin Luther King Jr. is rightfully lauded today for its utopian ideals concerning racial coexistence. That said, King's failures as a husband were brought to light via covert government surveillance efforts from both the FBI and the CIA.
The COINTELPRO bugged Martin Luther King Jr. They bugged his house, they bugged his hotel rooms, they bugged his office. They had people working in the SCLC who were working for the FBI. So they were on Martin Luther King hard.
Federal wiretaps revealed that King engaged in several extramarital affairs during his marriage to Coretta Scott King. This was despite the leader's own expectations within their marriage for his wife, namely that she stepped down from her activism in order to focus on motherhood. Further allegations assert that King allegedly bore witness to a sexual assault by an acquaintance, Pastor Logan Kearse, and rather than stepping in to stop it, quote, looked on, laughed, and offered advice.
Many of the source documents will not be available until the year 2027 based on a judge's order. When 2027 comes around, a lot of people will be interested in listening to those tapes and reading those transcripts.
Spying and sex trafficking. Chuck Berry.
There was a lot of backdoor, slimy stuff going on.
The history books will always credit Chuck Berry as one of the fathers of rock and roll music. Berry was convicted in 1962 for violating the Mann Act, a federal law whose design is to prosecute those who transport persons across state lines with intent for sex or prostitution.
They had met, I think, in Arizona or New Mexico. He brought her back to work in his club.
He had taken an underage girl across a state line.
The guitarist was also arrested for assaulting a woman in 1987 while staying at New York's Gramercy Park Hotel. Additionally, hidden cameras were found in the women's restroom of a restaurant owned by Berry, a case that Berry settled out of court. Anti-Japanese Sentiment. Theodore Seuss Geisel, a.k.a. Dr. Seuss. Warfare can be fought on many fronts, with one particularly important weapon being propaganda. Theodore Seuss Geisel, otherwise known as children's author Dr. Seuss, served in the United States Army's animation department in 1943.
Sounds harmless enough. Innocent stuff. But let's take a look in and find out what's cooking.
He wrote propaganda and training films for the Army during this time, while continuing to draw political cartoons and posters. Much of Seuss's animation during this time was critical of the Japanese and often disparagingly depicting the people.
We were allowed to use certain words that we couldn't use on the screen then, and maybe not even now.
The otherwise beloved author was just one of many Americans who were swept away in a wave of anti-Japanese sentiment during the Second World War. It doesn't excuse Seuss's actions or the content of his early books, but it also speaks to a larger cultural sentiment of the era.
He wonders who in hell it was that let his secret out.
Abuse and Abandonment. John Lennon.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try.
Music is a very powerful thing, and we as fans often tend to martyr our favorite artists. Yet perhaps we shouldn't, because behind every musician is a human being with failures and faults. John Lennon, by all accounts, failed as a father and husband, at least when it comes to his first wife, Cynthia Powell, and their son, Julian.
To a degree, I was abandoned as a kid, twice, if not 3 times in many respects.
Lennon's contradictory life included physical violence against Powell, during a time when much of the Beatles' music espoused peace and love. The songwriter's split from Powell was acrimonious as well, with the pair engaging in lawsuits over his infidelity with Yoko Ono, as well as Lennon's emotional abandonment of their son.
There was a great deal of anger there, but there's also, I've grown up a lot, and there's been forgiveness since then. But it was tough, yeah. It was very tough growing up, that's for sure.
Advocating euthanasia and eugenics. Helen Keller.
Every day she slips further away. I don't know how to call her back.
The deafblind activist Helen Keller wasn't the only politically minded individual of her time to advocate for euthanasia and eugenics. It just surprised many that a person who overcame so many physical challenges in her own life would espouse the destruction of another without giving it a similar fighting chance.
She did write about eugenics, and she was concerned that children with disabilities, who with severe disabilities, would not be able to function in society. I think it was part of that zeitgeist at the time.
Keller's opinion specifically reflected a 1915 case when a baby's life was allowed to expire after a doctor refused to operate. Keller charged those who advocated for the baby's life as containing, quote, cowardly sentimentalism, and she actively distanced herself from the disabled community throughout her adult life.
It is not blindness or deafness that brings me my darkest hours.
It is not blindness or deafness that bring me my darkest hours.
Overseeing COINTELPRO, J. Edgar Hoover.
Remember always that the spy and the saboteur or the destroyer carries no badge. He hides behind 100 fronts. He pretends innocence. He likes to rub elbows with patriotic men.
The figure of former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover is one that looms large over the agency's power and influence. One aspect of Hoover's controversial legacy includes operations that were conducted under the umbrella of COINTELPRO. These weren't just mere smear campaigns, but instead coordinated, unrelenting attacks upon groups that the FBI considered undesirable.
We knew the FBI was systematically trying to squash dissent, and dissent is the lifeblood of democracy.
The activities and lives of the Black Panthers, anti-Vietnam activists, and even movie stars like Gene Seberg were monitored by FBI agents. Phones were tapped, conversations were recorded, and assassinations were approved under COINTELPRO. as the FBI manipulated the media and committed psychological warfare against United States citizens.
The surveillance was so enormous that it led various people, rather sedate people in editorial offices and in Congress, to compare it to the Stasi, the dreaded secret police of East Germany.
Accusations of anti-Semitism. Roald Dahl. It often comes down to the consumer to decide whether or not we're able to separate the art from the artist.
And I agree with you, it is difficult. Very, very difficult.
Roald Dahl is responsible for a writing score of certified children's classics, including Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Matilda. However, this English veteran of World War II has also been accused of harboring sentiments that could be perceived as anti-Semitic.
I thought he was great at first, but then he didn't turn out so nice.
Dahl, in his defense, was quoted as saying, "I am not anti-Semitic, I am anti-Israel." The author's friends often labeled him as a provocateur and subject to saying things on a whim. Yet, this does nothing to hide the fact that some of Dahl's early work, such as Sometime Never and Madame Rosette, contains defamatory language concerning Jewish people.
Those kind of horror stories which you have specialized in.
Tickler.
Yeah.
Assault. Roman Palansky.
Here you come to a concrete case for which I have been behind the bars, and that's what you want to talk about it.
Some turn away at the accusations leveled against filmmaker Roman Palansky, due primarily to his genre-defining work with Rosemary's Baby and Chinatown. The writer and director even received the Academy Award for Best Director for 2002's The Pianist, which was released decades after Palansky's infamous run-ins with the law.
He was very powerful, very well known. I think when you're wealthy or powerful or well known, people don't say no to you, and you have like this different view of life where you're accustomed to getting what you want, because you get what you want.
The history of Palansky's alleged sexual crimes dates back to 1977, when he was arrested for drugging and assaulting a teenager in his native France. Palansky would inconceivably be arrested for this crime again that same year, this time with an underage model named Samantha Gailey. Serious jail time loomed for the director, who was informed of this incoming justice, and Palansky decided to escape from the U.S. prior to his sentencing.
Authorities here in Los Angeles have been unable to arrest Palansky before now. They say they've tried 6 times over the years. Yet when they learned he was going to be in Zurich this past weekend, they asked the Swiss to help catch him.
Advocating colonialism. Rudyard Kipling.
My dear boy, I'm a British officer. My job is to keep the law.
You keep not the jungle law.
Look here. I don't know about any jungle law, but I do keep man's law.
It doesn't seem unfair to say that many viewers of a certain age were first exposed to the work of English author Rudyard Kipling's literary work with the animated Disney adaptation of The Jungle Book. Kipling was born in British India, and it was living under these circumstances that provided a huge influence on his art, including his Jungle Book duology as well as a poem titled The White Man's Burden.
Boy, now look at that. The colour and majesty of India, the exquisite manners and food of England, all the bare necessities of life.
This poem's narrative offers a cautious yet encouraging advocacy of American colonialist efforts in the Philippine Islands, while The Jungle Book, yes, even the Disney version, presents imagery that mirrors Britain's own colonialist approach to Indian rule.
Espinagore! That's the way I earned my commission in the Maharaja's 5th Pachyderm Brigade. Back in '88, it was, what was it?
Here it comes. The Victoria Cross bit again.
Forced conversion and misappropriation of funds. Mother Teresa.
She probably make good work for church, but actually the care and the way she treated the sick people seems not to be what the media told.
The career and life of Mary Teresa Boiagiu, aka Mother Teresa, did contribute to providing health care to the poor, needy, and sick, people who had nowhere else to turn. However, it's also been alleged that the quality of this care varied and often came under the proviso of a forced conversion to Catholicism. These could be in the form of baptisms of children against their parents' wishes or deathbed conversions.
I have videos of her telling a congregation in Scripps Clinic
in 1992 that she was surreptitiously converting moribund people who were not able to give consent.
Mother Teresa also contributed to hiding the actions of priests that were accused of behaving inappropriately with children, and also came under fire for misappropriating funds for her own medical care against those designated for her mission.
India's Home Ministry refused to renew the Missionaries of Charity's license to receive funds from abroad, citing what it called adverse inputs, without giving more detail.
Marrying minors. Charlie Chaplin.
He was very taken with me. He had his cameraman photograph me in the position of the famous painting, The Age of Innocence. He thought that I resembled that little girl in the oil painting.
The world of old Hollywood is full of dark shadows that contrast the bright lights and dazzling stars. Charlie Chaplin's work during the silent film era was massive, influencing countless artists. Yet the man's personal life was tumultuous, from his left-leaning political sympathies to alleged sexual relationships with minors.
Charlie's assistant said to Charlie, "This is the little girl I've been telling you about," and I went running over to meet them. And Charlie looked at me and he said, "Oh yes, and she's very pretty. Now, would you like to be in a movie?"
It should be said that legal ages of consent have historically differed from both state to state and year to year, but Chaplin's first two wives were under the age of 18. His second spouse, Lita Gray, was alleged to have been a teenager at the time of their affair, during which she became pregnant. Gray would also allege that Chaplin pressured her for an abortion in order to circumvent the scandal of their secret marriage in Sonora, Mexico.
I couldn't quite figure out how this was the same man seated at this table as the man I saw on the screen. It kind of scared me.
Animal abuse allegations. P.T. Barnum.
Figured you'd end up here. Feeling sorry for yourself?
The modern-day sideshows, carnivals, and circus attractions all owe a debt of gratitude to the showmanship of P.T. Barnum. However, the man's style of operation within the circus business has come under large scrutiny over the years, particularly in the wake of 2017's The Greatest Showman.
I never liked your show, but I always thought the people did.
They do.
Specifically, Barnum often exploited real-life physical conditions for those appearing in his various sideshows, while other exhibits leaned heavily into racist and culturally insensitive stereotypes. The animals under Barnum's watch fared little better, with many of the tools used to get them to perform their shows also doubling as instruments of pain. The Kennedy Labotomy. Joe Kennedy Sr. Individuals historically turned to a lot of different places when it came to seeking out answers for mental illness. The surgical procedure known as a lobotomy was one of these places, and it wasn't only the poor that turned in this direction.
By the end of the procedure, she's basically lost the ability to talk, and it's clear that this has gone terribly wrong.
The Kennedy family patriarch, Joe Kennedy Sr., subjected his daughter Rosemary to a lobotomy during her early 20s. This was after complications during her delivery and birth resulted in Rosemary developing some sort of learning/intellectual disability.
From a young age, Rosemary, the eldest Kennedy daughter, was a bit slow.
She was diagnosed with learning disability at the age of about 6 or 7.
The public perception of Joe and the Kennedy family's feelings towards Rosemary range from ignorance to shame. It's also largely believed that the lobotomy was performed to both neutralize the Kennedy daughter's mood swings and ensure the political paths for Joe's sons were made more clear.
Joe was convinced Rosemary's lobotomy would somehow fix things, and then miraculously she would become a perfect Kennedy like all the other Kennedys.
The Bengal Famine. Winston Churchill.
It's not a matter upon which I am able to shed any clear ray of light at the present time. And if I were, I should certainly not shed it.
The legacy of former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Winston Churchill, was still being forged when this humanitarian disaster struck India back in 1943. World War II raged across the globe, yet this was also still the time of British colonialism in India. The war, specifically Japan's occupation of Burma, was devastating for India's economy during this time, with foodstuffs being diverted preferentially and strategically to military personnel rather than Indian natives.
কিছু ব্রিটিশ সোলজার সব ব্রিটিশ সোলজারের জন্য থাকবে কারণ খাবার ভালো খাবার জিনিস but this গরিব মানুষ যারা poor people.
Churchill's level of blame for the Bengal famine fluctuates depending on who you ask. with some quoting the Prime Minister's disparaging remarks towards India's people, while others claim Churchill's hands were tied and that he effectively, quote, did his best once alerted of the crisis.
Contemporary non-official observers reported from the start that this was a man-made famine. Calcutta newspaper The Statesman wrote, "The sickening catastrophe is man-made. The famine constitutes the worst and most reprehensible administrative breakdown in India."
Nazi Sympathy, Coco Chanel.
Operation Model Hat. Your code name is now Westminster.
The name Coco Chanel is synonymous with the fashion industry, yet the real-life historical figure behind this brand possessed a complicated history. We're speaking of Chanel's involvement with Nazi officials during their occupation of France during World War II. Chanel had an endgame in mind with regard to her SS collaborations, specifically freeing her nephew, who was being held as a POW.
She decided to go to the French collaboration government, and who were in touch with the Gestapo.
Chanel's romantic affair with Nazi officer Hans Gunther von Dinklage succeeded in this aim, yet she continued contact with the Nazi brass after the release of her nephew. One of Chanel's political allies was the aforementioned Winston Churchill, and it was via this influence that the fashion icon was able to avoid charges of collaboration after the war.
We've had many dinners together since the 20s, vacation together.
So, it's personal.
Oh, yes. Sir Winston has even taken the opportunity to cry on my lap.
Promoting segregation, Woodrow Wilson.
He introduced Jim Crow to Washington, D.C. At a time when it was just starting to loosen up, he brought it back, and it became, for all intents and purposes, the law of the land.
Armchair historians might like to point out how former U.S. President Woodrow Wilson probably would have wanted his 14 points or the League of Nations to be part of his lasting legacy. Instead, a recent light has since been shined upon just how reticent Wilson's presidency was to listening to voices of change and their increasing clamor for equality. The former president supported segregation at every turn, including enforcing it within the branches of the federal government.
In addition to this physical separation from whites, black federal workers were appointed to menial positions or reassigned to jobs slated for elimination.
Wilson worked to remove African American politicians from their posts, and he actively opposed the women's suffrage movement. Post-Civil War Reconstruction in America was not easy, but the 20th century presidency of Woodrow Wilson did a lot to help undermine a lot of that era's success.
Because on the one hand, he's got this abstract vision of a more just world that has all of this potential and possibility in it. And then on the flip side, for all of his big ideals, he is such a narrow-hearted little man.
The Siege of Drogheda, Oliver Cromwell. The mere mention of the name Oliver Cromwell is enough to elicit many passionate opinions.
And spit upon the name Oliver Cromwell.
The legacy of this former Lord Protector is nothing if not complicated, with some sides of history praising Cromwell's military might and others condemning him for the same reasons. The Siege of Drogheda was a military conflict often used to underline Cromwell's brutality while also criticizing the man's campaign in Ireland.
I heard afterwards that Oliver Cromwell had ordered his men to take no prisoners and to kill the innocent. He justified his actions by claiming that the massacre was God's vengeance for the murder of Protestants in the rebellion of 1641.
Sir Arthur Aston, who was in charge of defending the garrison, refused a chance to surrender to Cromwell's invading forces. As a result, nearly all of Aston's men were killed, along with an unnamed number of civilians. It's this latter fact that speaks to just how often Cromwell's opposition was slaughtered, seemingly without regard to mercy or decency.
Some defenders holed themselves up in St. Peter's Church. Cromwell's men set the church on fire and burned them all alive. When the Roundheads had finished, there were 2,000 dead for us to bury.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into Settings and switch on your notifications. The Indian Removal Act, Andrew Jackson. His visage remains on the $20 US note, but perhaps reckoning will eventually come for former American President Andrew Jackson. The man's problematic legacy has grown exponentially in recent years. thanks primarily to his enforcement of the Indian Removal Act in 1830.
The Cherokees actually won a Supreme Court case over land in Georgia, but Jackson ignored the decision.
The bill was signed into law by Jackson, and its enforcement was continued by the president's successor, Martin Van Buren. Under this act, over 60,000 Native Americans were forced to uproot and move west, a journey that became known as the Trail of Tears.
Many were shackled in chains and forced to walk at gunpoint more than 1,000 miles west on a series of routes that all led to Oklahoma. Up to a third of the 15,000 Cherokee who were forced to make the journey died.
The act is seen today largely as a strategic land grab movement by the United States, with Jackson's personal feelings asserting an idea that native self-rule should only take place upon federal land west of the Mississippi River.
They took everything from us. America's built on stolen lands. America is a stolen country.
Did any of these revelations surprise you? Let us know in the comments.
We knew that the FBI had us under constant surveillance, but I don't think anyone at the time really knew the full extent of the program, of COINTELPRO.
Check out these other clips from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.